Gregory Wrightstone is geoloog en president-directeur van de Amerikaanse klimaatskeptische organisatie CO2 Coalition. Wrightstone schrijft ook boeken waarin hij het klimaatnarratief kritisch belicht. Zijn laatste boek is onlangs in Nederlandse vertaling uitgebracht. En wij hadden de kans hem even te spreken in het zonnige Zeist.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Very
Sit
good,
down.
George. Thank you.
Sit down. Well, thank you for joining us, Gregory. I think we should probably get straight into it. Carbon dioxide, I think that's the substance of the hour.
It is.
It's the, according to some, it's the root of all evil.
The demon molecule. We call it, however, at the CO2 Coalition, we call it the miracle molecule.
Do you really?
We do. One of our unofficial mottos is, we love CO2 and so should you. So we're big proponents of more carbon dioxide, not less.
You are really, but this is according to the mainstream narrative and the prevailing doctrine on CO2 is that this is the agent that's going to lead us all into the apocalypse of rising sea levels, of searing temperatures, droughts, death, mass climate migration. But you don't quite see it that way, do you? You consider yourself a climate skepticist?
I'm a skeptic and climate. I'm a scientist first and foremost. And what we need to do is not listen to the rhetoric. Look at the data and the facts. And as a geologist, I look at the big term. I don't look at decades or maybe even hundreds of years. Put what's happening today in context of thousands and millions of years, and we'll find that the rise of 140 parts per million of CO2 is a blessing, and it's the current CO2 levels are actually at near historically low levels of slightly over 400 parts per million. The average throughout most of Earth's history was 2,600 times per million, 6.5 times where we are today.
So how does a geologist end up becoming an expert on what goes on up there in the Earth's atmosphere and what CO2 does around it?
Well, there are probably 30 different disciplines that make up the science of climate and studying climate change. And most geologists you'll find are like me. They're skeptics because we look at what's happening today and again, put it in that long-term geologic perspective. And what we find is we are in a warming trend. Sure we are. But the key point here is it's been warming for more than 300 years. And bear in mind, we didn't start adding significant amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It was in the mid-20th century in that post-World War II economic boom. And warming, and the warming trend we're in, though, started 200, 250 years prior to us adding CO2. So that first 250 years of warming had to have been entirely naturally driven, but we're being told those natural forces suddenly ceased in the middle of the 20th century. Yeah. That's not how it works. They're still in effect today.
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is what turned you into becoming a skeptic. What was it that triggered your skepticism?
It was probably about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. I started becoming interested in this. I knew as a geologist some of the things we're being told were just incorrect. For example, the main thing was ocean acidification. I knew as a geologist it just wasn't happening and it wasn't going to happen. I knew that for a fact. And so I suspected other things we're being told about climate change were also wrong. And so what I did was a deep dive into the science. And I said, I'm not going to trust one side or the other. I want to go back and look at the base data myself and make up my own choice, my own decision. And what I found frankly angered me. I found that on most cases, what we're being told by Al Gore, John Kerry, those that are pushing this climate alarm agenda were just wrong. The science, the facts, and the data just don't support many of these claims.
And then what was it then that you were obviously down there in the Earth's layers? What was it that you encountered that made you think something's not right here? Something's not adding up. What was it that didn't add up?
Well, these claims of climate catastrophe that are predicted or that we're actually being told they're ongoing. And when I looked at it, for example, forest fires in the United States, they claimed were increasing, and they have been slightly since 1983. But if you look at fire data, for example, going back to 1926, they hide that data. And we find that fires 80 and 90 years ago were 5 times as many as today, and 5 times the area burned. We see global fires from the Copernicus satellite data tells us that worldwide wildfires are in decline. We also have been told that deserts are expanding. The fact is deserts are shrinking. The Sahara, for example, the Sahel and the southern Sahara, 200,000 square kilometers of former desert have now turned into lush grasslands and farmlands. We're not being told that. We're not being told that, for example, tornadoes are, for example, the biggest ones are definitely in decline, and hurricanes are not increasing.
Well, you'd think that'd be in the newspapers.
Well, they need to establish a climate of fear. And that's that climate of fear that's needed for you and your viewers to voluntarily give up their freedoms, to let the government assume controls of every aspect of your life, what you drive, how you heat your home, how much water comes out of your shower. Every aspect of your life is being driven by governmental control based on this false notion of a climate crisis.
Well, we can get into that a little bit later, but let's stick to the science for the moment. What would you say is the main error in the accepted premise of CO2 and of man-emitted CO2
well,
in the climate doctrine?
It's got to be CO2, the volume and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's at 0.04% of our atmosphere. It's a very tiny, it's a trace gas. It's an important trace gas because life couldn't exist without it, but it's a very small trace gas. And CO2 we're actually CO2 impoverished compared to much of Earth's history. We don't have too much CO2, we don't have enough. And that's the big story, is that our plants arose up and evolved when CO2 levels were 5, 6, 7 times what they are today. And plants do much better at much higher CO2 levels. And we're seeing that reflected today in this, probably the biggest untold story is the thriving of our ecosystems due to the increase in CO2.
You're saying CO2 is actually beneficial to the planet?
By almost every metric we can look at. It's not just CO2, it's warming, believe it or not, is also beneficial. It's the combination of modest warming, and we've warmed about 0.8 of a degree since 1900 Celsius. Warming plus CO2, by almost every metric we look at, our ecosystems are thriving and prospering.
But do you subscribe to CO2 accelerating or triggering global warming?
CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's increasing. Yes, it has a warming effect, but it's very small, and it's definitely overwhelmed by the same natural forces that have been driving temperature increases and decreases since the dawn of time. We've had small amounts of CO2, less than 300 parts per million for the last several million years, but yet we've had huge temperature swings between ice advances and ice retreats. CO2 didn't drive that. They were natural forces.
And we have governments, we have international organizations, NGOs, big companies, big business, all getting behind the climate narrative, saying, you know, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to reduce CO2 emissions. And they have so much means, so much knowledge at their disposal and access to. Are they wrong? Are they all wrong, Mr. Wrightstone?
They're wrong about a lot of what they're talking about. When you talk about this, you can't help but say, well, Wrightstone's saying there's a global conspiracy to advance this theory. I don't know why they're doing it, but I do know the science, the facts, and the data dispute much of what you're being told. They need to silence people like me and my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition, because we tell a compelling, fact-based story that confirms there is no climate crisis. In fact, we've gone farther. Not only is there not a climate crisis, but Earth's ecosystems and humanity, the human condition's thriving because of what we're seeing with modest warming and more CO2.
These governments and big business and NGOs, you know, and the international organizations, they have all this at their disposal. So they have your facts at their disposal too. Why don't they take any notice of them then, do you think? So it would seem.
In some part, they do know a lot of this. In fact, I'd be surprised if they don't have all this information, but they need to hide some of this information to continue this global crisis scare.
And where do we see that being hidden then?
The IPCC, for example, I was accepted as an expert reviewer.
The UN Climate Panel.
For the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's a lot of good science in there, but it's hidden in thick tomes of scientific reports. The only thing people read is what's called the summary for policymakers, and that's put together by politicians, not scientists. And it's that the politicians, the summary for policymakers, where you get increasing wildfires, increasing drought, decrease in agricultural output, all of these things you've heard about, increases in extreme weather, that they make these claims. Within actually the science portion of this book of the IPCC that no one reads, they dispel a lot of that.
Now, you're a scientist, you're a geologist. We have these governments and the big companies. I'm just a regular bloke trying to figure out what's right, what's what in climate. How do I go about figuring out who's right here? Who should I be believing? And how do I go about finding out what I should be believing?
Yeah, that's a real problem because you're only being given one side of the story. You have to go step outside that echo chamber of climate crisis and pick up some of this other information. My books, for example.
Yeah.
There are other groups out there like Clintel, our group, the CO2 Coalition. We provide that. And we always provide also, when we give information and charts, we always provide what's the source. And if you go look at what the source is for a lot of the data we're showing, it's IPCC, it's National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, it's NASA, peer-reviewed studies. That's what we use, but we don't hide the information that dispels this climate crisis narrative.
Your views are somewhat off the beaten track. They're alternative. They go against the mainstream. What sort of pushback are you encountering?
Well, we deal with the science. We do get pushback a bit, but I'm actually surprised we haven't gotten more. Maybe it's because we do speak and refer to the science. It's hard to argue with me and my colleagues when we can provide the scientific basis that disputes what they're saying.
So once you present the facts, then the pushback goes away, does it?
It is, yeah. We need to be silenced. Otherwise, the jig is up, if you will, with this climate crisis narrative.
So how are they trying to silence voices like yours?
Well, no mainstream media will have us on because they say the science is settled. There's a consensus. There is no debate. If we allow these guys on, these people like the CO2 Coalition and Gregory Wrightstone, they're just promoting flat Earth, and it's nothing more. We are true scientists.
So you get deplatformed.
I was banned 3 years ago from LinkedIn. My very last post I made, I said, I think I'm about to be banned from LinkedIn, and they removed that, called it false and misleading, and then banned it deplatforming. And so it gets better. We started up an Instagram when I joined the CO2 Coalition as its executive director. We signed on to Instagram, and they deplatformed us before we could have our first post. We're still struggling to get on Instagram.
You got deplatformed before you.
Yeah, our reputation preceded us. So I wear that as a badge of honor, as I do my LinkedIn permanent banding.
You're obviously based in the US now, right? And you're now here in Europe. If you compare those two debates, the two climate debates, are they different?
They are.
Yeah. In what way?
In the United States, we have a much larger alternative media. I can get on quite a few radio shows, podcasts, and some national shows where I think it's much more tightly controlled. And thank you, George, for having me on today. But it's much more controlled here, I believe, than we have there. For example, I did almost 300 interviews last year, some 4 and 5 a day. And we're able to get our message out. And what I find, George, is they're thirsty for this information that we provide. They've never heard it. If I tell them these facts and I can show them the actual data, their eyes get wide. And they say, why haven't I heard this before? It's because we've been silenced. They need to silence us.
Well, we're very happy to have you, so we're not going to deplatform you here today. We like the alternative views at Ongehoord Nederland. Something in that respect I'd like to talk to you about is whether climate skepticism is growing. Is there a change in the trend? Is there a momentum shift, perhaps?
I see it. We see people like Steve Koonin, Dr. Koonin, physicist.
Yes, we spoke to him.
And he's able to get, he's got a platform. He's able now to have regular commentaries and op-eds on, for example, the Wall Street Journal. We're seeing more people out there responding well to our message. We're still not there on the mainstream media. We won't see it on national public radio in the United States or CBS, ABC, any of the others. Hopefully that day is coming. But when that day does come, it will be game over for this climate crisis narrative, because people will they will become awake. Because it's so easy to get distracted politically with this subject matter. And it can become political pretty quickly. But what I do see, I think COVID helped our cause a great bit. Because during COVID, we're saying the experts are wrong. During COVID, people said the experts are wrong. They're not always right. And before COVID, I think people just assumed that if you're an expert, we should trust you. And I think that's changed quite a bit over the last 5 years.
How big is CO2 Coalition? I mean, what's your budget? How many people are affiliated with you?
Yeah, we've got around 170 scientists. These are chemists, engineers. I'm a geologist. We have a lot of physicists and some top name physicists. Dr. John Clauser just joined our board. You may not know that name. He was the 2022 Nobel laureate in physics. It's hard to call him a science denier, but yet they do. We have some of the top physicists in the world, and it's physicists that deal with the radiative transfer, it's called, the greenhouse effect. What happens when molecules like CO2 and water vapor become excited, and how the greenhouse gas effect works.
I would say you're a climate activist. Would you agree with that? Or see it?
No, we don't do climate activism. We do climate informationalism, or I'm not. Is that a word? Is that?
If you say it's a word,
I think it's a
word.
new word. It's informationalism. We provide, rather than doing the activism, we leave that for other groups out there to do the activism. What we do is provide the basis for them to say they can hold up our scientific papers. You want to know about methane and the warming effect of methane? Here's a report from the CO2 Coalition on what's the warming potential of methane. You'll find it's extremely small.
Yeah, well, we're very familiar with the activist groups on the other side of the debate. Let's say Extinction Rebellion, for one. Greta Thunberg has been around. She was in The Hague earlier in the year. What's your take on someone like Greta Thunberg, on her message and the alarm she's sounding that we're destroying the planet and we're destroying our future?
Well, it saddens me, actually, and she's just a great example of why we need to get true science education into the school system. That she's never heard any of this information, and so that's part of our goal is to do that, is to educate quite uneducated people like Greta Thunberg, who doesn't know this. How do we do that? We're trying hard. When we're silenced, it's difficult to get that message out there.
But she's being backed by, there's big money behind her, government funding. There's big companies are funding her. She's receiving a lot of traction in that sense.
There's a huge amount of money. I've seen estimates that the climate realist portion, are outspent some 500 or 800 to 1, and I believe it. It feels that way sometimes. And so we have to use alternate media. We have to do things like put up billboards on a highway. There will be one coming soon to the Netherlands, believe it or not. The billboard I love, there's a young lady sleeping comfortably in bed, and the billboard says, "Sleep well, there is no climate crisis." And when people drive by, their heads go like that. And we know heads were exploding when they saw our billboard. And so there's one coming soon to the Netherlands.
I'll be looking out for that.
Yes, do that.
I'll be looking out for that. Another thing, if you're talking big money, obviously the energy transition is a big one. Not only the Dutch government, but many governments in the world and the EU and UN, the US government is investing large amounts of money into the energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels and into renewables. Would you say that's advisable?
Oh my, no. If you have what we need for electricity, well, let's just talk about electricity. Yeah. For electricity, President Xi, Prime Minister Modi of India, they know, like I do, what a thriving economy needs. What people need is abundant, affordable, reliable energy. You get that with nuclear, natural gas, and coal. You don't get it with wind, which may stop blowing or blow too hard. You don't get it with solar that quits every day regularly. These are very unreliable systems to provide electricity, and they tend to go away at the most inopportune times. At least in the United States, we've had huge cold spells that move in, and then it's very still. It's cold, there are no clouds in the sky, and there's no wind, and it's very cold. And so the solar panels are covered with snow, the windmills aren't turning, and they have to rely on decreasing amounts of coal-fired and natural gas-fired
that sounds like a fair argument. But perhaps some of our viewers might think, well, that's Mr. Wrightstone. I've seen his CV. He's been working in oil and gas for the past, couple of decades. He's just big oil, serving the big oil agenda. What would you say to that?
Well, I kind of wish we would get energy money from the CO2 coalition. We don't. Again, this is almost all grassroots, individual donor driven that we do here. And I've been out of that business for a decade or more.
Are there any negative climate effects of natural gas use?
When you burn natural gas is methane, CH4. When you burn methane, you get heat, you get water vapor, and you get carbon dioxide. And you get twice as much water vapor as you do carbon dioxide. So the only thing, the product of burning methane is water vapor and CO2. And neither of those are pollutants.
Well, we have one of the biggest gas field in this country up
Groningen.
In Groningen, yeah, by Slochteren.
Yeah.
Which has served this country well for many a year. It's recently been shut down.
It's been abandoned.
Yes. Well, it's not only been shut down, they're dropping concrete in there to make sure nobody ever gets back at it and to dig it up again and start pumping it out.
It's criminal what they're doing. The people of the Netherlands and the world need that clean burning natural gas. And it's going to be sad when we look back. At some point we will look back and say, oh my, what did we do? When we have regular blackouts and brownouts, when you really need that natural gas, it's not going to be there. Good luck to you and on a cold February or cold December day when you can't turn on the heat, when your heat pump doesn't work.
Let's say there's no real reason, CO2 isn't a reason for transitioning into different sources of energy. But I suppose you could say that exhaust gases aren't that good for you.
Well, if you look at,
there could be other reasons for transitioning to other energy sources.
I'm not sure what that would be.
Would you say there's a case for that to be made?
If you look at China, who doesn't do it very well in terms of that's coal-fired electricity.
Yes.
I've been to China, and it's really bad because they're not doing it right. We do it right here in Europe, United States. We can consume coal, make electricity, and so just about the only thing that comes out of those stacks are carbon dioxide and mostly water vapor. So the old days of the soot and all that should well be behind us. So we can particularly natural gas, a very clean burning fuel.
There's some people who said, well, I think we should be moving away from fossil fuels, and there are arguments for that, saying you'd be less dependent on the Middle East and issues there, and you'd be less dependent on cartels like OPEC
Look what we're doing. We're trading our dependence on Saudi Arabia to a dependence on China for green energy. We're relying on them for lithium, for copper, for cobalt. We're depending on the cobalt being mined by 12 and 14-year-old boys and then shipped to China for processing. So we're trading our dependence on OPEC and Saudi Arabia for oil to a dependence on China. I don't know about you. I think I'd rather depend on Saudi Arabia than I would China. And we're going more and more and more reliance on China. It's a dangerous thing. And if they shut us down, and this isn't just energy. This is the batteries in your cell phone are primarily 90% of that comes from China, and 90% of all the lithium is processed in China. And so we're trading one dependence to another.
What I was trying to get at was people are saying, well, perhaps you want to try and move to nuclear. That could be good. That could give energy independence. What would you say to that? Is there an argument for that?
Nuclear's good. The modern nuclear reactors, the small modular reactors, that's a real possible way for good, clean energy.
Thorium reactors.
Thorium, yeah. And, but the problem there is, if we get rid of, you don't want to jump out of the airplane without a parachute. Right now, that's what we're doing, because we're shutting down all of our reliable sources of energy and saying, well, we're hoping that wind and solar will be able to pick up the slack. Well, it's not going to be able to. And so I like the idea of nuclear, but how far are we from actually being able to power enough? We're probably, if we said today, let's go nuclear, and France has done a great job there. They've, just the opposite of Germany, France has really embarked on it. This was 40 years ago they started that. And so they're primarily nuclear-derived electricity. But we're probably, if we said today, let's do it, how long would it take to build all these reactors? It takes a long time anyhow right now. We're probably 50 years away from that.
Well, you could build those, obviously, but then there's the nuclear waste. That's always the argument for not doing it.
Well, that's why some of the small modular reactors, we're doing actually a report on that right now. I'm not an expert, but we have nuclear experts that are, where they're actually using that nuclear waste to power the new modular reactors.
Well, then, in closing it, Holland wants to go places, the Netherlands wants to go places. Let's say we were looking for energy independence. What would you say was our best way of going about that?
Well, I'd stop plugging those wells of Groningen. I would embrace both nuclear, encourage more natural gas development instead of shutting it down, and don't be scared of coal-fired power plants, coal-fired electricity. But it seems like the wave of the future is nuclear and natural gas for the most part. Go forward, be bold, don't be afraid. There is no climate crisis. What we're going to do, this country and others are on the wrong road that's going to lead to brownouts and blackouts in the not too distant future.
Gregory Wrightstone, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.